Eoin Leonard is the founder and CEO of i3PT certification. You did tell us this morning that that is an acronym, an abbreviation for?
Independent third-party testing.
Okay. We got plenty of volume on okay, Eoin. Independent third-party testing of what?
Fundamentally, the built environment. I guess when we look at that, we're looking at the two core sectors we're involved in are construction, which is obviously the development of new buildings or the renovation of existing assets, and obviously property as well. And with the property side of our business, we work with large asset managers, we work with pension funds and investment funds, some major investment banks, but we also work with developers who have to meet that demand. And on the other side of our business, we work quite a lot with occupiers. And when I say occupiers, I mean the kind of clients we're lucky to have in Ireland, foreign direct investment, the LinkedIns and the various other people who occupy these buildings and create a really sophisticated demand for Irish real estate. So we kind of cross the gambit in terms of the core actors, but yeah.
And is it all commercial? You don't do blocks of apartments?
No, we do. It's every sector, effectively. Everything
of the built environment.
To data center to, yeah, every
okay. And how much of your work is allied to a construction project, a new build, as opposed to looking at a building and looking at a retrofit?
I think traditionally it was probably 75-25. This year it's shifting more towards about 2/3 construction and 1/3 existing standing assets. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think that the core reason is that the market is shifting in terms of investor preference. We're seeing a big demand and a number of specialist funds that are set up to specifically go after retrofit and renovation. There's a number of reasons for that too. I think construction costs, and there has been significant construction cost inflation. In markets like Dublin, there's a lot of risk in the ground, so there's maybe less risk appetite for new build in some cases. We've certainly seen a few funds kind of shift away from new builds to look at good adaptive reuse projects, good adaptability options for various reasons.
We heard this morning, Eoin, a lot about data. I want to talk about the quality of data that you're looking at or that you advise on.
Sure. Well, I suppose within i3PT there are two parts to our business. There's the services side of the business, and that typically involves chartered engineers, architects, surveyors. We have applied physicists in the business. We have people with PhDs in sustainability.
You're based in Dublin, are you?
Based in Dublin, but we also have bases in London, Edinburgh, Milan. We're opening up in 2 other locations in Europe in the new year. So we've been operating across Ireland and the UK for several years. The pan-European thing is more recent and has been driven largely by legislation. So there's been a big demand for our services in that space. But when we look at data, first and foremost, it's making sure that people are tracking the right data and that they're tracking data that's material to their stakeholders. And by that I mean, if I'm a developer, I need to consider my occupants, and I also need to consider my investors. I need to consider refinancers and who am I going to have to satisfy in the future, and what kind of data are they going to need. Right? And things like the EU taxonomy have changed the data points that we're looking at. Traditionally,
we'll pause there. Yeah. The EU taxonomy, sure. Explain.
So the taxonomy is, I suppose, in its simplest form, it's a classification system for determining whether an investment is sustainable or otherwise. And it covers a large range of industries, and one of those is construction and real estate. Okay. The taxonomy is a companion piece to the non-financial disclosure regulations that are now hitting the market, such as SFDR and the incoming CSRD. But the taxonomy basically gives a dictionary definition to investors of what it means to be sustainable for a particular economic activity. For new construction, there's a series of things you have to do, and if you meet that criteria, you can claim the mantle of sustainable investment. If you can claim that mantle, your asset is arguably more valuable. You may be a better risk profile for people who are going to provide refinance or various things in the future. But beyond that, there's evidence, and I'm sure Rachel from CBRE, our company has done some research in this area recently. There's evidence to suggest that more sustainable buildings have higher yields as well, and better valuations. Right?
So, just so that I understand this, one thinks in terms of a rating, some of the materials used, the level of insulation, the whole heating system, the recycling of heat pumps, the electrification of heat. What exactly are you measuring?
When you're looking at, first there is the construction element for new construction. And when you're looking at that, you are looking at the primary energy demand of the building. And that is made up principally of things like building fabric and your services, right? So what is the building made of? Is that efficient? What are the services that are in place, and how do they react to the grid? How do they react to the people in the building, and so on and so forth? That's getting more and more sophisticated, right? But that's principally looking at operational energy. We're also looking at embodied carbon, and we're looking at how much carbon is taken to build things. And there's a big movement towards building less and building lighter. There's a big focus.
So, for example, if I'm building something, the spec of concrete that I use, the measurement of embodied carbon in the steel versus timber I use, do you end up going to the quantity surveyor, going to the engineers, no, you've got to use these materials?
You provide options, and you display the options in a way that makes them more attractive. Now, in some cases, they're going to be cost prohibitive. In some cases, they're quite achievable, right? It's not just the embodied carbon. The operational carbon choices are very significant as well. At the moment, if you look at a building over a 50, 60-year life cycle, operational carbon is the bigger amount. And that's being tackled immediately with primary energy demand. The taxonomy, for example, doesn't really deal with embodied carbon other than to say you have to count it right now. But there will be targets that will be set in the near future around that as well.
And I did a conference on ESG and the SFDR. There was a lot of talk about Scope 3 emissions, which are not your emissions as the operator of the building or the owner of the building, but your sub-suppliers and so on. Do you get into Scope 3 emissions?
We do. That's a life cycle assessment, and what they call global warming potential studies are required by the taxonomy, and that does get into Scope 3 emissions in quite a detailed way. And as an example, accuracy around that is very important. If you choose a default product over a specific product, there could be 400% in the difference between the embodied carbon and one and the other. So product choice makes a huge difference. You mentioned structure and concrete mix, and are you using virgin steel or recycled steel? All of these things are very significant. And what's driving that to a large extent is corporate commitments. It's not legislation necessarily, it's not even the traditional green building certificates and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, if I'm going to build something brand new, I'm going to expend a huge amount of embodied carbon to get there. And if you refurbish an existing building and you can give me a similar specification of building at roughly the same price, you're giving me a much lower carbon price tag. And that's going to matter with non-financial disclosures, because we're now doing for all intents and purposes, a carbon profit and loss, right? It's no surprise and it's no mistake or accident that we report SFDR to the central banks, because people invest in companies not just on their financial performance now, but also on their non-financial performance. Not just because it's the right thing to do, right? It's incentivized. I think companies who have good ESG performance traditionally have had more stability in their returns. KPMG did a study last year. I think they surveyed about 1,200 different CEOs across Europe, and 73% of them said that ESG initiatives had actually improved their financial performance. So it's not just doing it because it's the right thing to do, it's good business.
But is there an element of box ticking and greenwashing in this? And is there any real sanction for people who have poorer data or are lax?
Yeah, so right now, if we look at the SEC in America, there's been several sanctions. There's been fines and various different things handed out. And this was before the rules and regulations around non-financial disclosures had hardened as much as they have, right? So America is still North America, I should say, is still in the very nascent stage of defining what it means to be sustainable, but they're still handing out fines and they're still investigating people. We saw a very large asset manager having a 13% share price drop, right? So you don't need a government intervention or a fine for this to hurt you. And that was a 13% share price drop at the mere allegation of greenwashing. There was no evidence necessarily provided at that point in time. But that has used up enormous resource in terms of dealing with investigations and other things. So in terms of the stick, there's definitely a stick. And the stick might be public opinion more so than it's government intervention sometimes. Most of these companies are publicly listed. Reputational damage is enormous. You know, if you were to compare something like that, an allegation of greenwashing and the impact that would have had versus something like Grenfell Tower. And people haven't necessarily joined the dots between building safety and ESG just yet, but that's starting to come in the UK. We're starting to see that come up more and more in investor due diligence. When people are looking at purpose-built student accommodation or PRS, even people coming in from the UK now, they're asking a lot more questions around building safety. You know, how good that is.
Okay, let's talk about investment and cost optimization insofar as, you know, I use the anecdote, you spend 300,000 doing something to an old mansion to save €40 a month on your lecky bill, you know. Yeah. It's nice if you can afford it, but if you can't, you won't.
Sure.
So where is the sweet spot of cost, return on investment, and so on? Because this morning we discussed buildings that are prime candidates to be repurposed. Sure. And there must be issues in terms of this whole agenda.
Yeah, repurposing buildings can be cost prohibitive, and sometimes the physical characteristics of a building or the location of the building might lend themselves to them being a poor choice for adaptability. For example, if something is going to become obsolete as an office because of its location, or if it's not in the right demographic area, whatever it might be. So in general, there's always obstacles to repurposing buildings. In that regard, we do need more government incentives to improve that business proposition. But what I will say is we're already seeing people move towards that. Now what?
But is there a matrix you can walk in, look at a building and say, no, or you can say yes?
Absolutely, yeah. There are specific characteristics.
Do you ever walk away from projects?
Would we walk away from projects? We would advise clients to walk away from projects. We would advise clients to walk away from certain
These would be investor clients.
Yeah, on the basis. For example, if something had very poor floor-to-ceiling heights and you were looking to repurpose that as an office or to refurbish that as an office, once you've done the cost benefit analysis, you might come to the conclusion that irrespective of what we do to this thing, it's not going to be as valuable as the one across the road. And
But like yesterday, I was doing this mental health symposium in City Hall, and the dome, like, was about 70 feet up, and even the acoustics were problematic. But then you find since 1779, it's got a rich cultural, historical ambience that's priceless. Yeah. I mean, do you not have to balance these things?
You do. It's not necessarily always the job of the investor to do that, though, right? So if you look at Barcelona is a great example of adaptive reuse. They have tons and tons of legacy buildings and historic buildings that have been brought back into use for various different things. It's not always going to be on the basis of it achieving a particular BER or EPC. So it is a balancing act, right? And the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is starting to recognise the value of that embodied carbon and you know, the heritage value of those buildings and what needs to be done to incentivise keeping them.
But I quoted earlier the EU targets, and you know, they've upped it with fit for 55 rather than just the 30 original target. Are they, like, where's the sanction here? Because, you know, I've done, last Friday, I was working with the SIMI. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. Even with the most accelerated plan, the cars are so expensive. You've got something with a 15-year-old banger, they won't afford a 60 grand car, leaving aside charging points. They'll get to 150, they won't get to 950 by 2030. Agriculture, all your feed additives, all your change in grassland swards, legumes, clovers, and all the rest of it, unless you cut the national herd, you won't get to 25%. So my political sense of this is that ministers only really think to the next election. So the cat is not going to be belled in the lifetime of this government, right? And therefore, when I ask the question of my people in Friends of the Earth, and if we don't, because the Climate Act now, 2021 and all this, what's the penalty? Well, I actually find there are no penalties. Is this tokenism?
There's a degree of it, and I think what I will say is when you're looking at the penalties, exclusively looking at government or exclusively looking at, you know, politicians to come up with the answers is probably, firstly, it's not where it's going to come from in most cases. They have a massive role to play. They have to act, as I said previously, they have to act as if it is a crisis. You know, they have to act very quickly and make more radical decisions about what they incentivize. We're seeing other governments doing that, both in terms of bringing in penalties around existing business models that aren't sustainable. Poor buildings in Paris, poor buildings in the Netherlands and various other places, buildings that don't perform to the right level are going to be sanctioned and they will be taken out of the stock in terms of they will not be allowed to be leased or sold and so on and so forth. So we are seeing that stick coming in across Europe.
So if we continue, this 3% retrofit of all buildings per year, which presumably means over 33 years everything will be done. So it's stuck on 0.8, right? And it'll vary in member states where that's at. So what's going to happen then to implement that?
I would trust the private sector to have a significant role in that, because when you think about the business case for doing something like that, it's not all about government intervention or government incentives. It's not all about sanctions. It's actually about, when I talk to people in property, they don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about that. When I speak to investment funds, they don't think about that. They think about capital values. is this going to be a valuable asset or not? If it becomes stranded, it probably won't be. It will be less valuable, and that's a huge driver because that's your entire business case. If you're in investment management, it's cash flow and stability of cash flow, and sustainable buildings have higher yields, they have shorter void periods, they have higher occupancy, they tend to have higher capital values. They're a better bet for refinance, right? So there's a whole host of levers here. And what we're starting to see is all of the various different industry actors come together on that. Banks are starting to be more discerning about what they'll refinance. So are investment funds. We're starting to see that the criteria for technical due diligence when you're purchasing an asset is getting a lot more sophisticated. Even not just on environmental, but social characteristics also. So that is becoming
Like?
more. It varies, right? And depending on
Play areas or for like what?
Yeah, common area. Like, so the space between buildings is something I think Gensler Architects coined, but providing a good space for the community and a place that provides. I suppose the concept behind the space between buildings is most buildings are designed as though they're going to be viewed from a helicopter. The space between buildings is what people get to experience and see at eye level, right? But there's also initiatives around using green and blue infrastructure, utilizing the various different biodiversity initiatives that can be accessed for a development. But they're starting to come up with hard measurables around that kind of thing. I think where we've seen the most impact is something called the National TOMS in the UK. It's called the Themes, Outcomes and Measures. It was introduced as part of the Social Value Act in 2012, and it's probably one of the more meaningful things we've seen in terms of trying to measure social impact, especially for the property sector. There are very specific measures in there that you can target, and it's around, most of it is not around the construction phase, but around the operation phase. Are you spending money with local vendors, right, as opposed to sending everything to the central chill in the middle of Ireland or whatever it might be, right? Are you spending money with diverse vendors? Are you prioritising diversity and inclusion in the way you hire and the way you train people and various other things? So those types of things come into play when you start to look at the acquisition process as well. Right?
Now, there's a whole plethora of people selling products and services in the operations of buildings, smart use of electricity, timers, and all these things for washing machines, heating systems, recycling systems. Do you give advice? Because, we'll say when the first waves of technology came along for software, management software, accounts, you found that the big 4 or 5, EY, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, actually became advisors in this completely new technological space. Yeah. In terms of the kind of spectrum of thing, is that part of what you advise on operationally?
Data collection and data quality would be part of it. In terms of selecting or choosing certain systems, we'd be agnostic. Like the I in i3PT is something we guard fairly jealously, so we don't get involved in promoting a particular product or service outside of the products and services that we provide ourselves. Right? So we do provide a data collection platform, but we will take information from virtually any system that can do it, and that can do it well. And there are a variety of systems. I think I won't mention any here, but there's a ton of really, really good technology out there in property. The key thing is that people invest in the right infrastructure, right? And I think what I mean by that is that they're metering and monitoring at the appropriate level so that you can do something about it if you've got a problem. A lot of people will meter at the very basic level. And what that means is, I can tell you that the patient is sick, but I can't tell you exactly why. Whereas if I meter at the appropriate level, if I have the right resolution of data, I can tell you exactly what to do about it as well. Right, so that's the level to which we would advise.
So then, back to the business. You did a bit of name dropping in London with Savills boss yesterday. Yeah. Is the UK market, the US market, what are you looking at?
For us, we're focused principally on the European market, including the UK. For services, our software business is operational in the US as well. The reason we're focusing on the UK and the EU is because there's been harmonisation around that taxonomy legislation, for example. The UK taxonomy looks remarkably like the EU taxonomy, and as Rishi Sunak would have said himself, sure, why wouldn't it? Didn't we write the fucking thing ourselves when we were there, So they're quite aligned. There's a lot of harmony around the rules and the economic objectives and so on and so forth. So we're a lot of our work is kind of centered around that, actually. So yeah, we're doing quite a bit in the UK and then pan-European after that.
So the logical conclusion of my final question then is, how does Ireland compare internationally?
In terms of our building stock, we compare really favourably, right? So NZ, which is a European standard since 2021, I think, NZEB is based on cost optimality, and Ireland's NZEB is probably a little bit higher than most of the other NZEBs we've seen. Right? So every NZEB across Europe is slightly different in terms of how it's deployed. What we're seeing is the building stock, when you look at the energy performance coefficient in Ireland, tends to be quite high. We've had a lot of recently constructed assets as well. So we've had a bit of a construction boom over the last period. So for a lot of the people we're working with, ESG is principally opportunity, right? And even for some of the existing standing assets, the operational energy tends to be quite high because the standard of property management here is quite good. So when we work in the Italian market, there are bigger challenges there. Even in the UK, they've only recently introduced their version of NZEB in the last couple of months, which is Regulation 25B. So their standing stock is probably that bit further behind.
And what about Irish regulatory enforcement? How does it compare?
It's strong. I think in terms of the building standards we have are good. The design teams and like I mentioned the FDI element earlier. I think we've benefited enormously in Ireland in the construction industry from having that sophisticated demand. So my experience of designers and contractors, construction professionals in Ireland is very positive, and I think they stick to the standards quite well. In terms of oversight and post-ex verification of buildings, it's a little bit stronger as well.
All right. Well, we wish you well, and we thank you for your involvement in the Property Summit today. Ladies and gentlemen, EOIN Leonard,